In the Slammer. 35 years inside with Noel Razor Smith.
Hello and welcome to the In the Slammer podcast, 35 years inside with Noel Razor Smith. My name's Elliott Frisby and here we talk the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So Noel, we've talked previously about sentencing and what it's like in the Old Bailey and other places that you've been to. So I think what would be really interesting, something I certainly don't know, is what a lot of people won't know. What happens next? And not just where do you go with the police or where you go next, what's going on in your brain, what's the emotion of that? Does it get easier?
If you're a first timer, obviously for people who've experienced it before, it's a bit different. But you know, every year I think it's something about 20,000 new people going to prison every year. And if it's brand new to you, it only gets worse. It doesn't get any better. What you've got to imagine is once you reach the court, once you've been sentenced, that's the end of the police. You don't see the police again unless you've got some sort of outstanding charge they need to speak to you about. So when you're sentenced, you become the property really of the prison system. And you go down them steps, they put you into normally a dirty, dingy cell where you will then wait till, say, sometimes till about 7 o'clock at night, till all the cases are done, and then they have what they call a sweat box, which is a prison transport, will come around and pick everyone up. And what they'll do is they'll take you to a local prison first, local to the area, depending on whether you're convicted or unconvicted on remand. And I mean, one of the biggest shocks that most people who've never been in trouble before get is when they get onto prison reception, your first reception into prison. And it's psychologically designed to strip you down mentally, and they strip you down physically. For some people, it's the first time they've ever had to strip off in front of grown men in uniform. They strip search you. Sometimes they make you squat over a mirror to make sure you're not hiding anything, because the famous hiding place, the favourite hiding place of prisoners is up the rectum. And they will take everything that you own and give you a number. They take your name, they will give you a number, based on whatever number comes up on their computer that day in that sequence. And from then on, if you don't remember your number, you can't get anything, because everything runs on your number, whether you get a letter, whether you get mail delivered, whether you go for a shower, you have to give your number. So you quickly have to learn to accept that.
And how long are these numbers?
They're normally 5 or 6 digits.
Okay.
Depending on,
it's normally like learning a phone number almost.
Yeah, they've changed it all now. In the old days, they had certain codes for prisons. So, for example, if you were remanded into Wormwood Scrubs for your first prison, your prison number would begin with PJ. If you were remanded into Brixton, your number would start with the letter B. So now, what they've done is they've kind of, there's still a lot of the old numbers left in the system, but they kind of centralised the system. So everyone's number begins with an A now, and a variation of the number on the end of that.
Okay.
So, I mean, yeah, you're given a number. You take the horrible thing is you're stripped down. Your clothes are taken from you. If your clothes are not suitable for prison, you will be given prison clothes, which, believe me, are not second-hand. They're like about 50th, 60th hand. You'll be given socks that have been worn by 400 other prisoners, underwear that's been worn by 400 other prisoners, clothing that doesn't even fit you because they're in a hurry to get you through reception.
So I'm just curious at this point. So you're saying about clothes which aren't fit for prisons. What would that be?
I mean, clothes that, you mean well, a lot of people, if they're on bail and they're appearing in court, will wear a suit because they want to impress the judge or the jury. You can't wear a suit in prison. So if they're the only clothes you've got, that's going into storage and you have to wear prison clothes. Other examples are, say, steel toe cap boots. You're not allowed to wear them in prison, obviously. They're weapons. So they will take them, you have to wear prison shoes. Or if you've got something that's black, like a black tracksuit, because physical education instructors in prison wear black tracksuits. So if you wear one, it might be an aid to escape by pretending you're a physical educator. This is the kind of minute drudgery that these people look at. They look at things like this. You're not allowed a magnet. I had a travel set sent in by my daughter when I was first in prison, and all it was a comb, hairbrush, a toothpaste. They were all made out of plastic, but they had a little metal piece on and they were held in by a magnet that big. I was told I couldn't have them. I said, why? They said, well, security say you could get all them magnets, put them together and use them to climb the metal fence. And I thought, is that ever going to happen? Another thing is FM radios. Up until 1998, you were only allowed medium and long wave radios in prison. When I asked why, I was told that you can convert an FM radio, this before there was phones in prison, you can convert an FM radio to become a receiver and a sender. And I went, well, how'd you do that then? And it turns out you have to have a degree in electrical engineering and a state-of-the-art toolkit. But that doesn't matter to the prison security department. The fact that it can be done means it will be done. Another example with drugs is we weren't allowed to have bananas in prison up until about 2006. But you never see a banana in prison. When I asked why, I was told that prisoners can dry out banana skins and smoke the banana skins to become high. And my answer to this, to the governor who told me that was, Governor, how many people have you got in this prison who have committed their crimes due to their addiction to banana skins? How many of these people in this prison do you see queuing outside a chemist to get their banana skins, to get their fix? I said, the prisons are washed with heroin and other drugs, and you won't let us have bananas in case some old hippie myth that you can smoke the skins. But that's what prisons are like. Little things that you take for granted outside suddenly disappear. The main things are this. You cannot move, you cannot go anywhere without permission from the prison. Even to move outside your cell, you have to have a prison officer to unlock your cell physically and take... If they don't, you're in that cell for however long you're in there for. There is no freedom in prison, no freedom whatsoever. When they let you out for what used to be your 1 hour's freedom a day, which was exercise on an outside yard, it's now been cut by the government to 30 minutes a day. What they used to do was you could go out in the yard, but you couldn't play football or cricket or anything. You could walk clockwise around the yard without stopping and not speak to no more than 2 people, just a geezer next to you, and that was it.
And was that in the 2000s as well?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's the same.
Because I'm going off a topic here, but off the original question, but you do hear people moaning that prisons are a great place now where you can go and play table tennis and do this and they're saying, oh, you hear a lot of it. Oh, that's what's the problem now. People want to go back in prison because they're getting 3 meals a day and they're playing sport and they're doing all this. So I'll just
pull you up on one thing there. 3 meals a day. You don't get 3 cooked meals a day in prison. You get 1 cooked meal a day in prison. The other 2 meals you get in a plastic bag. You get breakfast in a plastic bag the night before, cold breakfast, and you get a cold lunch meal, which will be a sandwich and a packet of generic ready salted crisps and an apple.
It surprises me that you said...
you get 1 cooked meal a day in prison.
It surprised me you just said plastic bag, because plastic bag you could effectively do yourself, couldn't you?
No, they've already got holes built into them. You know those plastic bags where they've all been punched?
Okay.
So there's no air in them, if you like.
Yeah.
I mean, it just goes. But, I mean, yes, look, what people got to understand is there's several different categories of prison. So going to prison is not as simple as going to prison. If you're a remand prisoner, that is someone who may have committed a crime, hasn't had a trial yet, but the police have some objection to them being in the outside world while they wait for that trial, you'll go to prison. Now, take it the old days, what would happen was if you were unconvicted and you were nicked in London, one prison you would go to would be Brixton. So Brixton would be full of prisoners who had yet been convicted of any crime, but were on remand. So they got a bit more leeway. They could wear their own clothes. They were allowed to visit for 15 minutes every day. If you're convicted and you're, say, a low category, you're a category C prisoner, you will then go to a prison that hasn't got as much security. Eventually you'll be shipped there and you'll be able to do certain things that you can't in category B prisons. Then there's category A prisons, top security, which is where I spent a lot of my time. And within these prisons, you cannot move out your cell unless there are at least 2 prison officers and a dog to escort you where you're going. And it's called being on the book because the prison officers have a book with your picture and your name and details in, and that has to be carried by them everywhere you go, and everywhere you go is marked into that book. The time you went there, you go to the doctors in the prison, it's marked in, so they know where you are every minute of the day. At night, you have to put your clothes outside the cell. You have nothing in the cell except your bed. And in some prisons, they leave a red light on all night. If you're an escape risk, they think you're an escape risk, so that every 10 minutes when they look through the hatch or every hour, they can see you without turning the light on. So there's different degrees of prison. There's the dispersal prisons, which are the 6 most top security prisons in this country, down to DCAT prisons, which are open prisons, where if someone, say, embezzled their firm and has no previous conviction and is good standing can go there, or where people who are finishing off long sentences where they've spent many years in closed conditions get moved into there to prepare them to be released. So there's 5 different types of prison: A, B, C, D, and then you've got remand prisons.
Have you been in them all?
All of them.
Okay, so going back to after, say, sentencing, can you give me an overview of what it's like, excuse me, travelling to each one? Is one worse than the rest? Do you notice a difference in the way maybe the guards speak to you, the transport, the initial, the reception you called it? Is there a difference?
There is, and the first difference comes in the way you're transported to prison. Some prison, they use what they call a sweatbox, a prison transport, which is a cellular vehicle. It's basically a closed-back lorry or van with either 8 or 16 cells in it. And what happens is, here's how it works. You're in the cell at the court, right? The screws who are transporting you to the prison will come to your door. You have to stick your hands out the door. They put handcuffs on you before they remove you from the cell. They then escort you in handcuffs down to the prison van. You get onto the prison van, into the cell. Once you're in the cell, they take the handcuffs off and lock you into this cell. Now, what you can see in this, it's moulded plastic and steel. So the seat's moulded. There's a hole in the floor where if you really need to urinate, you can do it on the floor. There's no toilets in there. Obviously, I'm not going to stop to let you use the toilet.
And how long could you be in these for?
You can be in them for up to 6 or 7 hours. It depends on where you're going. I've seen people, I've been in one myself for 4 hours at Belmarsh, waiting outside the prison, in the actual prison, but waiting outside reception while they process everybody else, because Belmarsh is a prison where there's loads of people coming in and out every day. So they're really uncomfortable. You've got nothing to hold on to. There's no seat belts. So if you turn a corner shot, if they turn and they do it as a laugh, the drivers, a lot of them do. They used to swing them around all over the place because you're bouncing like a 9-pin inside that little cell. You've got a window in that cell that looks out onto the street, but it's tinted. So it looks like perpetual nighttime out there. You can see out, nobody can see in. So you're in this little box. You eventually get to the prison. 9 times out of 10, you're going to sit for at least 2 hours outside the prison in that little cell. That's 20 of your 16 or 18 or however many's in there, all shouting and being asked to be let out, banging on the walls and all that sort of madness, threatening people. So then you spend that time. Then you're taken into reception and it's been all day, you've been in court, the stress of everything that's happened to you, and then you're stripped and everything's taken away and you're given a number. Now, you can imagine that's your first day in prison.
So people are, by the time they're out of those cells, they're pretty worked up. They're like, I mean, they're ready to attack someone.
The people who've done it before are, because they know that what they're going through, they're going to go through again and again. The people for the first time are more awed by it and think, well, this is probably the worst bit of it and this is going to be over. Little do they realise it's just a start.
Yeah.
Once you're in prison, you allocate the cell, and in local prisons, you're normally put in with someone. Now, some prisons, you can be on remand and put in with 2 other guys. Now, this is the thing about it is this. Statistically, they're 2 strangers. One of them is going to be addicted to drugs, alcohol, anything like that. That's why their crimes were committed, and they will be coming off that alcohol and them drugs, so they're rapping. So you'll have one of them. And statistically, because 2/3 of the prison population have one or more recognisable mental illness, that's a fact, the other one is obviously going to be mentally ill. Now imagine you come off the street for the first time and you're put into a room, a small room, the size of the average family bathroom, with 2 people you don't know. You have no clue who they are or what they've done or what they're capable of. And you're in there, and what you've got is 2 bunk beds, a single bed, and a toilet in the middle of the room. And that's where you perform your ablutions. If you want to use a toilet, you're in the middle of the room. In most cells, prisoners are polite enough to turn to the wall when someone's on the toilet and open the window. Can you imagine in the summer? No, you know, someone with diarrhea in a cell the size of your bathroom.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And you will stay in there for 23 hours a day. Then what you're on is an induction wing. So that means it's the maddest wing in the prison with everyone running to and fro, trying to get things, trying to find out. Things like this. When you go into local prisons, the most common thing you don't have, a pillow. Because people who move over to the wings take the pillow with them, so they have 2 pillows over on the other wing. They don't replace them. So you can, many times I've gone into prison for the first time in the night and had to roll up my towel and sleep on that as a pillow. You know, you don't get no blankets or anything. Whatever's there is there. They're not really that interested. They spend 3 or 4 days inducting you, telling you the rules, and then you're individually shipped out to whichever wing they're sending you to. And when you reach that wing, you've reached real prison. That's where the prisoners are, the people who are, you know, at the game, people who are every day dealing drugs, people who are running protection rackets. It's like a mini criminal underworld when you get onto some of these wings. There's always a boss, a daddy, there's a little firm who are running things, you know, this guy, and then you immerse yourself into that life, and that becomes your life. You become part of it, just another cog in the big prison machine.
And how does that make you feel?
You lose your identity. You really do. The one thing, and in some ways I always thought it was a good thing, is this, that a lot of people, or some people in prison, they want to live their life in prison and outside at the same time. If you're doing a long sentence, that's not possible. You cannot be thinking of the outside all the time. I'll give you an example. We were sitting, there was 4 of us, and I was serving the least sentence, 17 years. The rest were serving 20-year sentence, just been weighed off. And this guy, we're sitting there waiting to go in and see the doctor. He went, what is it, 4 o'clock? If I was out now, I'd be having a barbecue. And everyone just went, listen, mate, you better stop thinking like that and shut your mouth, because that is not the way you can live life in prison. You drive yourself mad. What's my wife doing now? What will my kids be doing now? You have to immerse yourself in prison to survive. And the reason you have to do that, and the proof of that, is that if you look at the statistics, more long-term prisoners every year end up in mental institutions than people on the outside, because they can't cope with the long sentence. They've got every day is the same. Imagine waking up every day to the same people, the same faces, the same routine every day. And a lot of people lose it and think, God, I've done 5 years, I've got 10 years to serve, I just can't do it. That's why the suicide rate and self-harm rate is so high. That's why people end up in mental institutions from prison. Quite a lot get sectioned off. Because when you think about it, human beings, we're not geared for captivity. We're free people. You know, man's been roaming the earth since man was on the earth, and it's unnatural to lock human beings into small spaces. And eventually, like rats in a maze, they lose it. You have to be very strong mentally to survive a long prison sentence.
So what have you seen? Let's just talk, because there's so much we're going to talk about once you're inside prison and what's that like, what it's like. But what have you seen happen to people? Let's just say they've been locked in that sweatbox and they've come out. And how have you seen people react, whether in that initial state or when they've actually finally made it to the wing?
It's terrible. It really is terrible what prison does to you. I was just thinking there when you were saying that about a guy I knew in Albany prison on the Isle of Wight, and he was from the East End, and he'd been done when he was 17. He was in a fight in a pool hall. Somebody handed him a knife. He had no previous convictions. He'd never been in violence before. He stabbed 2 people and got both of them in the heart and killed the pair of them, and was jailed for the rest of his life. And I remember meeting him when he was 18 years into his sentence. And we had some chats, and he said, I just can't do it anymore. He said, I really can't. He said, and I was trying to get him to seek help. And what he ended up doing was, and I was on the same wing as him when it happened, and it was horrific, was he sat down one night, broke open his razor and cut his penis and testicles off in the hope that he would die. And it was the only way he could think to do it. Cut them off with a razor blade. And, you know, I've seen people go absolutely mental. I've seen guys come running out of cells in the morning, holding a Bible and a table leg and just attack all the people. You know, they just go absolutely mad. One of my first pieces of violence I saw in Borstal, which was quite horrific as well, we got put in the cells. The next morning we opened up and the landings face each other. So there's a netting and a gap there, and there's a cell opposite you, and you stand outside your doors. We were all juveniles. Stand outside your doors so the screws can tick you off on their list to make sure you're still there. And I'd been moved into this cell the night before, and there was a guy here, and he was huge. He was about 18, but he was absolutely huge. And I seen him. He was standing. He looked at me. He kind of gave me a right dirty look. And paranoia is rife in prison.
Okay, so in case you noticed that we just did an edit there, that's because the content was going down a route that perhaps we shouldn't publicise. So we're just going to pick it up from where we left off. So you were saying about this guy giving you that dodgy look, and you're next door.
Yeah, there's this huge fella, and I moved in next door, and we're all lined up the next morning, and he kind of looks at me, and it was one of those slow, you know, and I thought there's something wrong with this guy. He was really silent, but he was huge, and he looked like he was seething. And then all of a sudden, I've put my eyes straight front, looking at the guys across on the landing, and the one in the cell opposite him, which is just there, suddenly yawns. Never thought nothing of it. This fella goes into his cell, turns on his heel, goes into his cell. I hear a bit of banging, and he comes out with, in prisons, you've got iron beds, or you did in the 70s. They're not, you know, you could take the legs off the iron bed. The leg weighed about 3 pounds, and it was about that long. And quite often people would use them as weapons, and this is what happened here. He took the leg off his bed, he marched round the landing, and I'm watching, everyone's kind of looking, what the hell is he doing? And he's walked round, got in front of the guy who yawned, and absolutely laced him in the face with his iron bed leg. It turned out he fractured his cheekbone in his eye socket, knocked out 8 of his teeth and broke his jaw, and then went into the cell and started lumping him with his thing all over the body. And the screws obviously see it, the bell went off, they come rushing up, but by the time they got to him, he'd finished his work, and what he'd done was he just walked, never said a word, walked out the cell, dropped the iron bed leg on the floor, put his hands up, and they carted him off. Now, it turns out, when he's in front of the governor the next day to be charged with it, the governor said to him, "Why did you do it?" And he said, "Well," he said, I come out of my cell and I was in a bit of a bad mood. He said, I looked across the landing. He said, and the geezer in the cell opposite yawned at me. So the governor went, "He what?" He said, "He yawned at me in an aggressive manner, as if to say, 'Do you want a row, you mug?'" He said, so I couldn't let that go. He said, I had to go and do him. And that was the first time in jail that I realised there are absolute maniacs who will do anything to you, what pops into the head, and prison is a very, very dangerous place. And I see lots of stuff like that over the years.
Well, do you know what? We're going to definitely dive into that further another time. But just hearing what you're saying there, I mean, for anyone who's even considering a line which could get them in that circumstance, it's just avoid it at all costs, isn't it?
If I could just tell you another cautionary tale, really. I was in Wormwood Scrubs in 1998, and there was a fella upstairs. I was in a double cell, and there was one guy in a cell on his own upstairs. His cell was empty. His cellmate had gone to court that day and didn't come back. What happened was someone come back from court and they put me in the cell with him. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, the whole wing was woken up by screams, absolute screams of fear. And it turned out what had happened was this. The guy they put in his cell, they opened the door, and, right, there's your new cell, get your water in there. They've put him in with this young fella, young skinny geezer, only a shoplifter, couldn't hold his hands up. And he said after the screws had gone off duty at 9 o'clock, which they all leave the prison except for the night patrol, they can't open the doors unless they get the gatehouse to open them. This fella suddenly, he had some coloured pencils, the guy who was in the cell, some crayons, because he used to colour in stuff. And he was reading a book, and this guy got off his bed, took his shirt off. He said, I was kind of watching him, but I wasn't, you know, we're in the cell together, and I don't really, he's not really saying a lot, so I don't want to antagonise him. Took the coloured pencils, went over to the wall by the door and started drawing a circle. So he said, I'm watching him. He said for about 20 minutes, he's drawing this circle, whistling away to himself. Then he starts drawing numbers in. It's like a clock face, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He said, I'm not really, he said, I'm watching him, and I think, he's a bit strange, this fella. He said, then all of a sudden, he done an hour hand on the 2. He said, and he's done a minute hand pointing at 5 to 2. He said, then he suddenly turned around and he went, oi. He said, I looked at me and went, what? And he said, with that minute hand, which is the hour hand, I'm going to cut your throat. And the kids went, what? And he went, you heard me. Started smashing up the table, got a jagged edge of the table leg, wooden table, and started stabbing this guy. Now, you've got nowhere to run. You're in a cell, and there's 4 steps, and you're hitting a wall. And he ended up, this guy had to try and get underneath the bed. He got under the bed. He stabbed him about 25 times and probably weighed him in. He got under the bed, and he was stabbing him under the bed with this piece of wood. Everyone cutting into him, going like 2 or 3 inches into his body. How he never died, I don't know. And he's screaming, and he's got a plastic piss pot, which is what you get in a cell instead of a toilet in those days. And he's trying to hold that up in front of himself and praying that the screws are going to come. The next door neighbour gets on the bell, and eventually a screw comes up, opens his ass and said, what do you want? And he went, can't you hear what's going on next door? Screws looked through the thing, see all the blood all over the walls, and went, oh my God. Of course he can't open the door, he's got no key. He's had to leg it down to the office, phone up the gatehouse and say it's an emergency and wait for them to send 2 officers over to open the door. By they opened the door, the geezer was nearly dead.
So those stories just sound horrific, to tell you the truth. I mean, everyone's, you know, you see these things on TV, you know, they get sentenced, and next thing you know, they're in this journey with a polite chain on them, and then they go in. Occasionally you might see them get hosed down, and then that's it, very sort of American. But what you've just described just sounds awful, you know. So what would you say, how would you summarise that?
Violence is kind of endemic in prison, you know. I mean, what you have to understand is that, you know, all the people out here that you read about in your local newspaper or you hear about who've been attacking people, or someone's glassed someone in a pub, or someone's attacked people for no reason, they all end up in prison. They're your neighbours in prison. These guys who commit violence on a whim or commit violence because they think they've got a grievance. Violence is really endemic in prisons. And I think, you know, there are certain violent acts that are specific to prison. I mean, if I could tell you about some, one of them is called teabagging. I know that means something of a sexual nature out in the outside world, apparently, because when I talk to students and I mention teabagging, they always laugh. But teabagging in prison is basically 2 or 3 prisoners with small, sharp implements who will attack a victim, usually when they're in the shower and naked with no weapon. And the aim is to stab them as many times as you can within about a minute and then get away. And the reason it's called teabagging is there used to be an advert for Tetley Tea where Roy Hudd or somebody used to say every teabag's got 1,000 perforations. And that's what you're aiming for when you're teabagging somebody with a knife, is 1,000 perforations. Because in prison, violence has to put you out the game. You don't want to see this person again, because if you do, there's going to be more trouble. So you have to go over the top in your violence. Another feature of prison violence is scalding, which is called jugging. Every prison landing now has a boiler on the landing that heats water so that you can go out and fill your jug or your cup with hot water to have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. Some prisoners will fill up a jug, put sugar, 1/2 pound of sugar into the jug with a boiling hot water. It melts. When they jug you, throw it in your face, the sugar will actually strip the skin off your face and melt you. Another one is called fatting up. In the dispersal prisons, you're allowed to cook your own food. There's a kitchen on every wing. So some people, if they get into a grievance review, will buy a couple of pounds of lard. I've seen it done. And what they'll do is cook it up in a pot, and then they'll throw that in your face, and that will strip the skin straight off you. I see a guy in Albany getting it done once, £3 of lard. It was a yardie fella. He'd had an argument with a fella in the kitchen over a cooking space. And the Londoner didn't want to back down, but was forced to back down and went, right, I'll get him. So this guy used to go to the recess every night, the toilet, before going into his cell. And all the toilets in prison, those privacy, they're all half doors, you know, so you can see over them, you can see under them. And he had this certain toilet he used to go in every night at the same time before he went to his cell. And the guy knew it. He cooked up this pot of lard, £3 of lard, went up the landing with cloths wrapped around the handles of the pot and looked over the top and went, remember me, and threw it straight over his head. And this guy, the screams, it was keening, really. He weren't screaming. It was horrific. And a big crowd gathered. He staggered out of the cubicle with his trousers round his ankles, and his hair was falling out in clumps and smoking on the floor. The skin was stripping off him. And he fell over and hit his head on the urinal, which knocked him out, thankfully, when he went down, because then, you know, at least he was unconscious. And this is how hard and brutal prison is. There was a crowd of inmates had gathered to watch this, and a couple of screws ran in and were on their radios trying to call up the medics to help him. And smoke coming off this guy, and someone at the back of it's not funny, but someone at the back of the crowd shouted out, "Frying tonight!" Like the catchphrase out of the Carry On film.
Yeah.
And everyone laughed. But how horrific it was. They had to get in professional cleaners to clean the recess of skin and hair. And for 2 weeks after that, the smell of burning flesh on that wing, they just couldn't get rid of it. Every time he came in off exercise, it stunk like burning. Prison violence is horrific and brutal. It really is a shock to the system when you see it happen for the first time. But it's quite common in jail.
Well, if that's not enough to put people off, I don't know what is. I don't know what is. And do you know the thing for me? I mean, we actually started this podcast talking about what happens after sentencing.
Yeah.
And I think it's amazing that it very, very quickly turned to violence.
Once you're in prison, that's what happens.
I think we will cover this in another podcast, most definitely. And I appreciate you sharing them stories. And so if what would you say? What would you say to anyone out there now who's thinking of?
See, I mean, in all seriousness, if anybody is out there and they're on the cusp of crime, or they're kind of dabbling with thinking, well, you know, I've read the papers and prisons are holiday camps. If holiday camps killed an average of like 500 people a year, or lost 500 people a year to suicide, thousands to self-harm, if the average holiday camp had a murder rate 7 times higher than the outside world, then yes, prisons are like holiday camps, and I hope you enjoy yourself. But the reality is, prisons are a horrible, nasty, violent place. Nothing like what you see on the films. They're really not. You know, they're frightening, terrible, paranoid, violent places. And if you think you can handle all that, you know, I thought I could handle it when I was going back, but I was mistaken, mate. You know, you can't go through that sort of atmosphere or live in that atmosphere without it affecting your mental health severely. And that's why a lot of people end up getting sectioned from prison.
Thanks, Noel.
So don't do it, seriously.
Yeah, I appreciate that. If you've got a question for Noel, you can write a comment below if you're watching on the YouTube channel, or make sure you subscribe and click the little bell so you get alarmed as well of things that we're doing. And if you're listening on the podcast, you can contact us at intheslammer@monkeynutuk.com. That's intheslammer@monkeynutuk.com. Leave Noel a question or share your thoughts, and we'll try to address all of them. Thanks, Noel.
You've been listening to In the Slammer with Noel Razor Smith, hosted by Elliott Frisby, music by Andrew Stamp, produced by Chris Byland, recorded at MonkeyNut Audiobooks. For more information, visit the In the Slammer Facebook page or visit monkeynutuk.com. If you have a question or want to contact Noel Razor Smith, then please email intheslammer@monkeynutuk.com.